The sun hung like a merciless eye in the bleached sky when Clara Jennings rode into Dustwell at high noon, her horse's hooves raising clouds of alkali dust that settled on everything like the ash of burned dreams. What stopped the townspeople mid-conversation wasn't the sight of another drifter God knew they'd seen plenty. It was what she carried cradled against her chest like a sleeping child wrapped in a scorched wool blanket that couldn't hide the smell of smoke and charred flesh. Tommy, her 8-year-old son, dead 3 days now, but still warm in her arms from the heat of her grief. Clara's face was carved from stone, weathered by 30 years of prairie wind and the last week of unspeakable loss. Her dark hair hung in tangles beneath a man's hat, and her dress was stained with soot and tears that had dried to salt tracks on her cheeks. But her eyes, Christ, her eyes burned with a fury that made even the drunkards outside Hannigan's saloon step back into shadow. She pulled her mare to a halt directly in front of the saloon's batwing doors, where half the town's men were gathered like carrion birds, nursing their whiskey and their gossip. The silence stretched taut as barbed wire. Inside Clara's chest, something was tearing apart the part of her that had been wife, mother, gentle woman. What remained was harder, sharper, forged in the flames that had taken everything she'd ever loved. She felt it crystallizing with each heartbeat, pure, distilled vengeance. I want to know. Clara said, her voice carrying despite its quiet tone, cutting through the heat-drunk air like a blade. Which one of you yellow-bellied sons of bitches murdered my boy? Someone Pete Hoskins from the general store let out a nervous laugh that died quick and ugly in his throat. Lady, you're touched in the head. That fire was an accident, plain and simple. More laughter rippled through the crowd, but it had the brittle edge of men who knew they were standing on rotten ground. Clara dismounted slowly, never taking her burning gaze off them. She laid Tommy's body across her saddle with infinite tenderness, then turned back to face the assembled cowards. Accident. The word came out like a curse spoken over a fresh grave. My house burned in 3 places at once. My son died screaming while you brave men slept safe in your beds. And you call it accident? The laughter died completely. In its place came something worse, the collective shame of people who'd sold their souls so cheap they'd forgotten the price. In the shadows beside the blacksmith shop, a man with prematurely gray hair watched with haunted eyes, his face pale as bone. Elias Ford knew what the others didn't, that Clara Jennings had every right to her fury, and that before this day was done, Dustwell would learn the true cost of cowardice. 6 weeks earlier, Clara Jennings had been a different woman. Still a widow, her husband Jack had died in a quarry collapse 2 years back, but she'd been surviving, even hoping. The 160 acres of scrubland she and Jack had homesteaded wasn't much, but it was theirs. More importantly, it was Tommy's inheritance, the only gift she could leave him in a world that seemed designed to grind poor folks into dust. But Maxwell Brant had other plans. The drought had been biblical that summer, turning the prairie into a cracked moonscape, where even the tumbleweeds gave up and died. Clara's well ran dry in July, forcing her to haul water from Devil's Creek 3 miles away. Her few head of cattle grew gaunt and mean. The vegetable garden that had kept them fed withered to brown stalks that crumbled at a touch. Still she endured. Prairie women were bred for enduring. Brant's first offer came in August, delivered by his smooth-talking foreman Wade Barker, a sum so insulting Clara sent Barker away, with words that would have made a mule skinner blush. The second offer came in September this time from Brant himself, a silver-haired man with pale eyes and soft hands who spoke of practical solutions and the boy's future, while his gaze assessed her property like a hawk eyeing a lame rabbit. Mrs. Jennings, Brant had said, sitting uninvited at her kitchen table while Tommy played with wooden soldiers on the floor. You're fighting the inevitable. This drought's going to break you, same as it's broken half the county. I'm offering enough money to start fresh somewhere green, somewhere your boy can have prospects. Clara had poured him coffee she couldn't afford and kept her voice level. "Mr. Brant, this land belonged to my husband's people before him. It'll belong to my son after me. We're not leaving." Brant's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind those pale eyes. "Stubbornness is an admirable quality, Mrs. Jennings, but it can also be expensive." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. After he left, Clara had stood at her window, watching his black carriage disappear down the rutted road. Tommy tugged at her skirt, his small face worried. "Mama, that man made you sad." Clara knelt and pulled her son close, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. "Some men think they can take whatever they want, sweetheart. But this is our home. Nobody's going to take it from us." She'd meant every word. What she hadn't counted on was how completely Dustwell would abandon her. Maxwell Brant owned more than land, he owned souls. His Red Creek ranch sprawled across 3 counties like a diseased kingdom. His money was in the bank that held most mortgages, his influence reached into the territorial legislature, and his coin bought silence from men who'd once called themselves decent. Neighbors who'd helped during Jack's funeral suddenly found reasons to avoid her. Store owners who'd extended credit when times were lean now demanded cash up front. Even Reverend Morrison, who'd baptized Tommy and buried her husband, began looking through her during Sunday service like she was already a ghost. Only one person showed Clara any kindness during those final weeks, a drifter named Elias Ford, who'd appeared in town about a month before the fire. He was a quiet man in his late 30s, with silver threading his dark hair and eyes that held old pain like water holds light. He'd taken work at Murphy's Livery, keeping mostly to himself, but twice he'd helped Clara load her water barrels without being asked. And once he'd slipped Tommy a stick of peppermint candy when he thought she wasn't watching. "You don't have to be kind to us," Clara had told him after the second time. "Won't make you popular." Elias had touched his hat brim. "Ma'am, I stopped caring about popularity some time back." There was weight in his voice, the kind that came from carrying ghosts. Clara recognized it because she'd been carrying her own since Jack died. That final night, Clara had tucked Tommy into bed after reading him another chapter from the adventure book they'd been working through. He was in good spirits, despite their hardships, chattering about the wild mustangs he'd seen running beyond the creek. "Mama," he'd said as she kissed his forehead, "when I grow up, I'm going to catch wild horses. Then we'll have enough money to fix everything that's broken. You can be anything you want, baby. This land will be here waiting for you." Those were the last words she'd spoken to her living son. Clara woke to the crackle of flames and the acrid bite of smoke in her lungs. For a heartbeat still caught between sleep and waking, she thought it was just the kitchen fire, burning low. Then she heard Tommy screaming. The hallway was already choked with smoke, the floorboards hot enough to blister bare feet. She could see orange light dancing at the far end Tommy's room. She stumbled forward, calling his name, but the smoke was too thick, the heat driving her back like a physical force. "Tommy, Mama's coming." She tried to push through, but a burning beam crashed down, blocking her path completely. The ceiling above was sagging, ready to collapse. Tommy's screams were getting weaker, more desperate. "Help!" She burst through the front door into the cool night air. "Somebody help, my boy's trapped." But there was no one. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and even if they'd seen the fire, they wouldn't have come. Not for Clara Jennings. Not anymore. She ran to the well, forgetting it was dry then, to the horse trough. Bucket after bucket of water thrown at flames that laughed and reached higher, consuming everything she'd ever owned, everything she'd ever loved. By the time she accepted that she could do nothing, Tommy had stopped screaming. The fire burned until dawn. Clara stood in her nightgown, watching 30 years of life turn to ash and ember. When the sun rose, she picked through the still smoking ruins with burned hands until she found him. She wrapped Tommy in the quilt from her own bed, miraculously spared, and loaded him onto her horse. Then she rode to Dustwell to demand justice from people who'd forgotten what the word meant. Sheriff Tom Watts met Clara at his office door, but wouldn't let her inside. Behind him, she could see Maxwell Brant's black carriage parked outside the bank, and understanding hit her like a physical blow. "Now, Clara," Watts said, not meeting her eyes, "I know you're grieving, but there's no call to gut. There's every call." Her voice was flat dangerous. "My house was fired deliberately. My son was murdered." "You got proof of that, witnesses?" Clara stared at the man who'd once been Jack's friend, who'd eaten at their table, who taught Tommy to whittle. Now he looked at her like she was a stranger, begging for coins. "The fire started in 3 places, Tom. I could smell kerosene even through the smoke. You know as well as I do that wasn't accidental." Watts glanced nervously toward Brant's carriage. "Could have been lots of things. Old house dry timber, maybe a spark from the fireplace. Look, Clara, I'm sorry for your loss, but without evidence, then I'll find evidence. You do that. But first you need to bury that boy proper. It ain't decent carrying him around like that." The words hit Clara like a slap. "What's not decent, Tom, is letting child killers walk free in your town." She turned away from him and walked to the center of Main Street, where the noon crowd was gathered like vultures around fresh carrion. That's when she made her demand, her voice cutting through the heat-drunk air like judgment itself. Some of them laughed, but in the shadow of the blacksmith shop, Elias Ford watched with the face of a man staring into his own grave. "Time you moved along, widow woman." Wade Barker emerged from the saloon with 3 other men, his hand resting casual-like on his gun butt. Barker was built like a grizzly and twice as mean, with a reputation for settling disputes with his fists and worse. "You're disturbing decent folks." Clara didn't budge. "I'll move when I get answers. Who killed my son?" "Nobody killed your boy." Barker stepped closer, and Clara caught the smell of whiskey and old violence on him. "Accidents happen. Sometimes to folks who don't know when they're not wanted." The threat hung between them like a loaded gun. Clara's hand moved to Jack's old Colt at her hip, the worn grip familiar as a prayer. "Careful now." Barker grinned, showing teeth like old ivory. "Wouldn't want you to do something that'd make us forget you're a lady." "The only thing I ever was that made me a lady was having something to lose." Clara's voice carried no heat, which somehow made it more terrifying. "I don't have that problem anymore." More men spilled from the saloon, forming a loose circle. Clara found herself surrounded, still holding her son's body, facing down a dozen men who looked at her like something they'd scrape off their boots. "Maybe we should help the lady bury her boy," someone suggested, and ugly laughter rippled through the crowd. "Proper-like." "Maybe we should help her find a new town," Barker added. "One that appreciates difficult women." Clara's finger moved to her trigger, but she was outnumbered 12-1. If she started shooting, she might take a few with her, but she'd end up dead beside her son, and Tommy would never get justice. That's when Elias Ford stepped out of shadow into sunlight. "Uneven odds," he said quietly, his hand resting on his gun butt. Dozen armed men against one woman holding her dead child. Barker turned surprised. "This ain't your fight, Drifter." "Maybe not. But I've developed a powerful dislike for bullies." The air crackled with the promise of violence. These men were hungry for blood, but they were also cowards at heart, and 2 guns were harder odds than 1. "Smart man knows when to walk away," Barker said. "Smart man knows when to make a stand." Elias took another step forward. "Question is, which kind of man are you?" The standoff stretched tight as piano wire. Then Sheriff Watts came hurrying up the street, looking like a man who'd seen his own hanging in a dream. "What's all this?" he demanded. "Barker, get your boys back inside. Clara, I told you to handle your business private-like." "My business is justice," Clara said. "Your business is burying your dead and accepting reality." Watts turned to the crowd. "Show's over. Move along." The circle broke up reluctantly. Barker gave Elias a look that promised future pain, but stepped back. "This ain't finished," he said. "I expect not," Elias replied. After the crowd scattered, Clara found herself alone with the drifter in the dusty street. She studied his face, reading the guilt written there like scripture. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why help me? You could have walked away like everyone else." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe because I've walked away from too many fires already." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "You were there that night." He started to speak, then stopped, his face going pale. "I should have done more." "What do you mean?" But Elias was already backing away. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Sorrier than you know." He disappeared into the livery stable, leaving Clara alone with her grief and her growing certainty that everyone in Dustwell was carrying secrets, and that some of those secrets had killed her son. Clara rented a room above the general store with her last $20, ignoring Pete Hoskins' obvious reluctance. She laid Tommy's body on the narrow bed and sat vigil through the night, her mind working like a clockwork trap, planning, calculating, preparing for war. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She would find proof of the arson. She would identify every man responsible. And she would see them dance at the end of a rope. The first lead came from an unexpected source. Walking past the schoolhouse the next morning, she heard a small voice call her name. "Mrs. Jennings." Toby Mitchell stepped out from behind the building, a shepherd boy of maybe 12, all gangly limbs and serious brown eyes. His father ran a few scraggly sheep on the hills west of town. "I heard about Tommy," he said quietly. "I'm real sorry, ma'am." "Thank you, Toby." The boy glanced around nervous-like, then stepped closer. "Mrs. Jennings, I might have seen something. Night of the fire." Clara's heart kicked like a Mustang. "What did you see?" "I was up on Eagle Ridge with the flock. Couldn't sleep account of the heat. Saw riders heading toward your place maybe an hour before the flames started." "How many?" "3. Had their faces covered, but one wore a snakeskin hatband that caught the moonlight, just so." Clara knew only one man in 3 counties who wore such a thing, Reuben Keats, a saddle tramp who'd been drawing Brant's pay since spring. Keats had a reputation for doing work other men wouldn't talk about in daylight. "Toby, would you tell the sheriff what you saw?" The boy's face went white. "I don't know, ma'am. Pa says it's dangerous to cross Mr. Brant. Says folks who do tend to have accidents. Your pa's right. But my son is dead and his killers are walking free." Toby wrestled with conscience and fear, then nodded slowly. "If it'll help catch Tommy's killers." "Yes, ma'am. I'll tell." The second piece of evidence came from Elias Ford, though he didn't know he was providing it. Clara had been watching the drifter for 3 days, noting his haunted expression, his tendency to drink alone after work. On the 4th night, she followed him to his room behind the livery. She found him sitting on his cot, staring at a half-empty bottle of rot-gut whiskey like it held the answers to all of life's questions. "Figured you'd come eventually," he said without looking up. "You were there that night?" "Yes." "Tell me what you saw." Elias took a long pull from the bottle, his hands shaking. "I saw your house burning, heard your boy screaming." His voice broke on the last word. "And I did nothing." Clara felt rage rise in her throat like bile. "You could have helped, could have saved him." "I know. Then why didn't you?" Elias set down the bottle and finally met her eyes. "Because I'm a coward, Mrs. Jennings. Because the last time I ran into a burning building, I couldn't save anyone then either, and the sound of people dying while I lay there helpless, it broke something inside me that never healed right." The raw pain in his voice made Clara's anger falter. "What happened?" "Atlanta, during the war. I was fire brigade captain. House collapsed with a family inside, woman and 3 children. I went in after them, but the stairs gave way. Broke my leg, pinned me under a beam while they burned to death above me." He shuddered. "Just like your boy." Clara understood then. The weight in his eyes, the guilt that followed him like a shadow. "That wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I was trained for rescues. Supposed to be brave. Instead, I froze when people needed me most." He looked at her with haunted eyes. Same as I froze when Tommy needed me. Clara sat on the wooden chair across from him. But you saw who set the fire. 3 riders. One threw bottles at your house, kerosene bombs. Flames spread so fast. He closed his eyes. I recognize the one with the snakeskin hat. Reuben Keats. Will you testify? If it means facing Brant's guns, if it means maybe dying for my trouble. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Yes, I owe you that much. Owe Tommy that much. The third piece of evidence almost got them both killed. Acting on Toby's information about the riders' route, Clara and Elias searched the hills around her burned homestead. They found horse tracks, several empty bottles reeking of kerosene, and most damning of all, a piece of paper that had fallen from someone's pocket, a hand-drawn map showing Clara's property with notes in Maxwell Brant's distinctive hand. Water rights, Clara read aloud. Creek access, copper survey-rich veins accessible. He wasn't just after your land, Elias realized. There's metal under it, enough to make him wealthy beyond dreams. Clara folded the paper carefully. Premeditation. With Toby's testimony and what you saw, we might have a case. But their investigation hadn't gone unnoticed. That evening, as Clara walked back from the cafe, where she'd forced down a few bites of supper, 3 shadows detached themselves from the alley beside Murphy's barbershop. Evening, widow woman. Wade Barker said, his voice honey over broken glass. Heard you've been asking questions. Clara's hand moved toward her gun, but Frank Coley, another of Brant's hired killers, already had his weapon drawn and aimed at her heart. It wouldn't, Barker advised. Might give folks the wrong impression. What impression would that be? That you're looking for trouble instead of just grieving proper-like. Barker stepped closer. See, Mr. Brant's a patient man, but patience has limits. You've been stirring up mud, making accusations you can't prove. Time to accept reality and move on. The only reality I accept is that your boss murdered my son. Barker's hand shot out, grabbing her throat and slamming her against the alley wall. Your boy died in an accident. Keep saying otherwise and you might have one yourself. Clara clawed at his grip, black spots dancing in her vision. Just as consciousness began to slip, gunfire erupted from the mouth of the alley. Barker released her and spun, drawing his weapon. Elias Ford stood silhouetted against lamplight, smoking Colt in his hand. Not Frank Coley's done with bothering folks. Elias said calmly, though his hands were shaking. Question is, do you boys want to join him or walk away? Barker raised his gun, but the third man, Rodriguez, grabbed his arm. Not here, Wade. Too public. After a tense moment, Barker holstered his weapon. This ain't over. I hope not, Elias replied. After they melted back into shadow, Clara slumped against the wall, rubbing her throat. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Elias said grimly. I just killed one of Brant's men. Things are about to get considerably worse. By morning, Sheriff Watts had issued a warrant for Elias's arrest on charges of murder. The official story was that Frank Coley had been gunned down in cold blood while walking peacefully. You need to run, Clara told Elias as they met secretly behind the livery. They'll lynch you. I'm done running, he said firmly. We take our evidence to Judge Morrison in Millerville. He's not in Brant's pocket. Clara nodded. Then we go together. This is going to be dangerous. Brant won't let us reach the county seat. Then we make sure he can't stop us. They rode hard through star-drunk darkness, following game trails and creek beds to avoid the main roads where Brant's men might be waiting. Toby met them as planned on the old mining road, mounted on his father's mule and carrying food his mother had packed without asking questions. By dawn, they were 20 miles from Dustwell, high in the broken country that separated the valley from civilization beyond. They stopped to rest the horses, thinking they were safe. Clara was checking their back trail through Elias's field glasses when she spotted the dust cloud. Riders, she said. 6, maybe more. Elias cursed. Brant must have had watchers on every road. How'd they find us? Toby asked, his young face pale. Doesn't matter, we keep moving. but their horses were tired while their pursuers rode fresh mounts. Within an hour, the gap had closed to rifle range. Clara could make out individual riders, Barker in the lead. Reuben Keats beside him, 4 others she didn't recognize. "There's a box canyon ahead," Elias said, studying the terrain. "We might make a stand there." They pushed their horses harder, but it was futile. Gunfire cracked across the rocks as their pursuers got within range. A bullet whined past Clara's head, close enough to part her hair. "Ride," she shouted to Toby. "Get to Millerville, tell them what you saw." But the boy shook his head stubbornly. "I ain't leaving you." A rifle shot took Clara's horse in the chest, sending the animal tumbling. Clara rolled clear gun in hand. Elias wheeled back, helping her up behind him, but now they were riding double on a tired horse while death closed in. The box canyon was a trap, sheer walls, no way out. As they entered the narrow defile, Clara realized they'd made a fatal mistake. "We're pinned," she said. "Then we make them pay for every yard," Elias replied grimly. They found cover behind fallen rocks with good fields of fire. The battle was brief, but vicious. Clara proved deadly with Jack's Colt, while Elias showed the steady nerves of a veteran. They beat back the first assault, wounding 1 man and forcing the others to cover. But ammunition was running low, and time favored their enemies. "Mrs. Jennings," Barker's voice echoed off stone walls. "You're trapped. Come out peaceable. Maybe we'll make it quick." "I'll go to hell. Have it your way." The second attack came from 2 directions. Elias took a bullet in the shoulder, his rifle clattering away. Clara tried to cover him, but there were too many targets. She felt fire tear through her leg as a bullet found meat. That's when Toby Mitchell did something brave and stupid. The boy came charging down the canyon on his mule, whooping like a Comanche and firing his father's old scattergun. The surprise scattered Brant's men momentarily, but it also exposed Toby to return fire. Clara watched in horror as Reuben Keats took careful aim. No, the shot echoed like thunder. Toby pitched forward and didn't move. Something snapped inside Clara then. The careful control she'd maintained since Tommy's death shattered like glass. She came up from cover screaming, Jack's Colt blazing, charging straight at Keats. Her first shot took him in the chest. Her second caught his throat as he fell. She kept firing until the hammer clicked empty, screaming Tommy's name with each pull. When the gun smoke cleared, Keats was dead and Clara was on her knees beside Toby's still-formed tears, cutting tracks through the grime on her face. "Clara." Elias's voice was gentle but urgent. "We have to go. They're regrouping." She looked up with eyes that held a kind of madness. "He was just a boy." "They killed another boy." "I know. But if we don't move, they'll kill us too, and Tommy will never get justice." That pierced her grief. Clara reloaded with shaking hands and helped Elias to his feet. Together, they slipped through a crack in the rocks the attackers had missed. But the cost was terrible. Their key witness was dead, they were both wounded, and they were still 20 miles from help. Worse, Clara could feel something precious dying inside her, the last remnant of the woman she'd been before the fire. "What now?" Elias asked as they stumbled through broken country. Clara's voice was flat empty. "We finish this, one way or another." As they made their painful way toward a distant Millerville, neither noticed the figure watching from the rim rock above Wade Barker, very much alive, with a telescope trained on their retreat and murder in his smile. They walked for 2 days through country designed to kill them. The sun blazed overhead while water ran out on the second morning. Elias's wound festered despite Clara's care, and her leg throbbed with every step. But they kept moving, driven by determination that bordered on madness. Clara had entered a strange state where pain seemed distant, unimportant. All that mattered was reaching Millerville and justice. They were 5 miles from the county seat when the trap closed. It happened at a creek crossing where they'd stopped to drink and clean their wounds. Clara was kneeling by the water when she heard the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked. Surely hoped it wouldn't come to this. Sheriff Tom Watts said, emerging from Cottonwoods with his badge catching afternoon sun. But you wouldn't let it lie, would you, Clara? Behind him came Wade Barker and two others, all armed and positioned to prevent escape. Clara's hand moved toward her gun, but Watts shook his head. Don't make me shoot you. Jack was my friend. Jack was your friend, Clara said, rising slowly. But Maxwell Brant's money was your master. Watts had the grace to look ashamed. It ain't simple. Brant owns half this county, employs the other half. Start a war with him, everyone suffers. So you let him murder children for peace. Nobody murdered nobody. Watts snapped, though his voice carried no conviction. That fire was accidental. I know Reuben Keats set it on Brant's orders. I know my son died screaming while good men did nothing. Clara's calm tone was more terrible than screaming. I know you're all going to burn in hell. Barker laughed harshly. Big words for a woman with 4 guns on her. Clara looked at him with those dead eyes that had frightened hardened killers. 4 guns. 2 murderers, 1 coward, and 1 dead man who doesn't know it yet. Which one am I? Watts asked despite himself. You tell me. The silence stretched tight. Clara could feel Elias coiling beside her, calculating odds and angles. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. Here's what happens, Barker said. You ride back to Dustwell with us. Sheriff arrests you for Frank Coley's murder and killing Keats. You get a fair trial. A jury Brant owns. A jury that understands law and order. Barker's smile was ugly. Course, if you resist arrest. Clara understood perfectly. They'd take her back for a show trial and hanging while Elias had an accident on the road. Perfect Justice Brant style. What about him? She nodded toward Elias. Drifter tried to escape. Had to be shot. Tragic. Elias straightened despite his wound. Mrs. Jennings, it's been an honor. The honor was mine. They were preparing for their final stand when salvation came from an unexpected direction. The Sheriff Watts, thank God. A rider approached at full gallop, a young man in brown suit and derby hat, with a deputy marshal's badge catching sunlight. Deputy Marshal Collins, Watts said carefully. What brings you here? Collins pulled up his lathered horse. Looking for you all over. Judge Morrison sent me to investigate reports of vigilante activity. Clara's heart leaped. A federal marshal, someone who might care about justice over politics. The no vigilantes, Barker said quickly. Just arresting murderers. Collins studied the scene, taking in their battered condition and the guns trained on them. These the murderers. Clara Jennings and Elias Ford. Watts said. Wanted for killing Frank Coley and Reuben Keats. Collins moved closer to Clara, noting the dried blood, the hollow look in her eyes. Ma'am, you look like you've been through hell. Want to tell me your side? My side is simple, Marshal. Maxwell Brant had my house burned with my son inside. These men helped cover it up. Now they want to kill us to keep quiet. Collins glanced at Watts. Serious accusation, Sheriff. Ravings of a grief-mad woman. She's been making wild claims since her boy died in that accident. Accident, Collins tasted the word. You investigate this fire personally. Of course, tragic accident but no evidence of foul play. Mind if I see your investigation notes? Watts shifted uncomfortably. Don't have them here? Of course not. Collins turned back to Clara. You got evidence for these claims? Clara reached carefully into her jacket, pulling out the folded map. This shows my property in Maxwell Brant's handwriting with notes about copper deposits. We found it where the arsonists waited. Collins examined the paper. Does show premeditation. Where'd you find it? Quarter-mile from my burned house with empty kerosene bottles and horse tracks. Witnesses. Clara's voice broke slightly. Had one. Shepherd boy named Toby Mitchell saw the riders heading toward my place. Was going to testify. She stared at Barker. But they shot him down yesterday when he tried to help us. Colin's expression hardened. Another serious accusation. Another lie. Barker snarled. Boy died in crossfire when these murderers ambushed us. Ambushed you in a box canyon while outnumbered. Collins shook his head. Gentlemen, your story has more holes than a rusty bucket. The deputy marshal stepped back, hand on his gun. We're all riding to Millerville together. Judge Morrison can sort this out proper. This is my jurisdiction, Watts protested. My prisoners. We're your prisoners. Now they're federal witnesses in a conspiracy case. Colin's voice carried quiet authority. Problem with that sheriff, take it up with the territorial governor. For a moment, Clara thought Barker might try something. His hand twitched near his gun murder in his eyes. But even he wasn't fool enough to shoot a federal marshal. This ain't over, he told Clara. No, she replied, it's not. The major twist. 3 miles from Millerville, Deputy Marshal Collins called a halt near an abandoned way station. Clara thought it was just to rest the horses, but something in his manner set her nerves on edge. Mrs. Jennings, Collins said, dismounting and loosening his gun in its holster. I'm afraid there's been a change of plans. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. What kind of change? Collins smiled, and it was nothing like the friendly expression he'd worn earlier. The kind that pays better than a deputy marshal's salary. Elias cursed under his breath. Brant got to you? The kind that pays better than a deputy marshal's salary. Collins said, his friendly mask slipping away to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. $5,000 to make sure you two never reach Judge Morrison. More money than I'd see in 10 years wearing this badge. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her. Another betrayal, another ally revealed as enemy. But this time, instead of despair, she felt only a cold, familiar rage settling over her like armor. How long? She asked quietly. How long what? How long has Brant owned you? Collins shrugged. Since yesterday. Caught up with me on the road, made an offer I couldn't refuse. Nothing personal, you understand. Just business. Sheriff Watts looked sick. Collins, you can't execute 2 fugitive murderers who tried to escape federal custody. Collins' smile was reptilian. Barker here will back up my story. Won't you, Wade? Barker's grin was all teeth and no warmth. Be my pleasure. Clara looked around the desolate way station, crumbling adobe walls, scattered bones of long-dead cattle vultures, circling overhead like an omen. It seemed fitting somehow. This was where her quest for justice would end, not in a courtroom, but in the dust with bullets and blood. Elias, she said quietly, I'm sorry I got you into this. Don't be. Been walking toward this moment my whole life. Despite his wounded shoulder, the drifter's hand was steady on his gun. Question is how many of these bastards we can take with us. Collins drew first, but Clara was faster. Jack's old Colt bucked in her hand as she put a bullet through the false marshal's chest. He went down hard, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun like a fallen star. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Elias took Rodriguez with a clean shot to the head, while Clara dove behind the way station's broken wall. Barker and Watts scrambled for cover behind their horses' bullets, flying wild. They should have taken Brant's money and run. Barker shouted over the gunfire. Now you're gonna die for nothing. My son wasn't nothing. Clara screamed back, putting 2 shots through the horse Barker was hiding behind. The animal screamed and went down, pinning the gunman's leg. Elias had found cover behind an old water trough, blood seeping through his shirt where his shoulder wound had reopened. Clara Watts is flanking left. She spun, seeing the sheriff trying to circle around. Once she might have hesitated. Tom Watts had been Jack's friend, had held Tommy as a baby. But that man was dead, killed by cowardice and Brant's gold. What remained was just another obstacle between her and justice. Her shot took Watts in the stomach, doubling him over. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees, clutching his belly. "I'm sorry, Jack," he whispered, blood frothing on his lips. "I'm so sorry." Then he toppled forward and was still. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the distant cry of vultures. Clara emerged from cover, her gun trained on Barker, who was still trapped under his dead horse. "Pull me out," he gasped, his face pale with pain and fear. "My legs broke bad, like you pulled my son out of that burning house." Clara's voice was flat, emotionless. Barker's eyes widened as he saw his death written in her face. "Wait now. Wait just a goddamn minute. I never laid a hand on your boy. That was all Keats and the others. But you covered it up. You threatened me. You would have killed me right here if you could. Business. It was just business." Barker was babbling now, desperate. "Brant pays good money for loyalty. Man's got to eat, got to survive. My son had to survive too." Clara cocked her revolver, the click loud as thunder. "But you decided his life was worth less than your pay." "Please." Clara's shot echoed across the empty wasteland. Wade Barker jerked once and was still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky where vultures waited. Elias limped over, pressing a bandana to his bleeding shoulder. "It's done then." "No." Clara shook her head, reloading her gun with mechanical precision. "Brant's still alive. The head of the snake is still breathing. Clara, you're wounded, exhausted. We both are. And Brant's got an army of gunmen. Then I'll kill them all." She looked at him with those cold, dead eyes. Every last one who had a hand in Tommy's murder. Elias grabbed her arm with his good hand. "That's not justice, that's revenge. And revenge will eat you alive until there's nothing left of the woman your boy loved." For a moment, Clara wavered. She could feel the madness calling to her, promising the sweet release of violence without conscience or restraint. It would be so easy to become the monster Dustwell had made her. But then she heard a memory of Tommy's voice reading aloud from one of his adventure books. "The hero always does what's right, Mama, even when it's hard." Clara closed her eyes, feeling hot tears cut tracks through the dust on her cheeks. When she opened them again, something had changed. The madness was still there, but contained, now controlled. "You're right," she said quietly. "But this isn't over. Not until Brant faces a judge and jury. How our witnesses are dead, our evidence is circumstantial, and half the county's afraid to speak against him." Clara looked down at Colin's body, noting the deputy marshal's badge and official papers scattered in the dust. An idea began to form, dangerous, audacious, but possibly their only chance. "Maybe they don't have to speak against him," she said slowly. "Maybe we can make him speak against himself." 2 days later, Clara Jennings walked into the Dustwell saloon at exactly high noon, her boots ringing on the wooden floor like the toll of a funeral bell. The conversations died as men turned to stare at the woman who should have been dead, who by all rights should have been lying in an unmarked grave somewhere in the wasteland. She wore Deputy Marshal Colin's badge pinned to her black dress and carried official-looking papers in her left hand. Her right hand, as always, rested on Jack's old Colt. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "I'm here on official business, federal business." Maxwell Brant sat at his usual table in the back corner, flanked by 2 bodyguards Clara didn't recognize. His pale eyes showed no surprise at her appearance, only cold calculation. "Mrs. Jennings," he said calmly, raising his whiskey glass in mock salute. "I heard you were dead, killed while resisting arrest along with your drifter friend. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Clara moved closer, the papers rustling in her hand. "As have reports of your innocence." Brant's smile was winter cold. "I don't know what game you're playing, but that badge doesn't belong to you. Collins was a federal marshal. You're just a mad woman with delusions of justice. Was. Clara agreed. Collins was a federal marshal, right up until you bought him, right up until he tried to murder federal witnesses on your orders. She threw the papers on his table. Collins' correspondence with the Territorial Marshal's office, his orders to investigate corruption in Dustwell, his reports documenting Brant's criminal enterprise. He kept very detailed records. Clara continued, including a confession he wrote before trying to kill us, just in case something went wrong. Insurance, you might call it. Brant's face remained impassive, but Clara saw his hands tighten on his glass. Even if that were true, which I doubt, it proves nothing against me, doesn't it? Clara pulled out another document, one she'd spent 2 sleepless nights forging in Collins' handwriting. This letter to the territorial governor details your conspiracy to commit arson and murder. Names, dates, financial records, everything. Forgery, Brant said. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. Maybe. But are you willing to bet your life on it? Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every man in the room. Because that's what this is, Maxwell. A bet. Your life against my son's justice. The saloon was dead silent. Even the piano player had stopped, his hands frozen over the keys. Clara could smell fear sweat and whiskey, could hear the rapid breathing of men who suddenly realized they were watching something that would end in blood. Here's what's going to happen. Clara continued, straightening to her full height. You're going to confess to murdering my son. Right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses. Or I'm going to kill you where you sit. Brant laughed, but it sounded forced. You're outnumbered, Mrs. Jennings. I have 2 armed men, you're alone. Am I? As if on cue, Elias Ford stepped through the saloon's batwing doors, his rifle cradled in his arms, despite the sling on his shoulder. Behind him came 3 other men Clara didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals with the look of professional gunfighters. Allow me to introduce my associates, Clara said calmly. Mr. Ford, you know. The others are federal marshals sent by the territorial governor after Collins failed to report in. It was another lie, but a believable one. The 3 men were actually bounty hunters Clara had hired with the last of her money-promised payment from Brant's assets after his conviction. But in the dim light of the saloon, with their badges and official bearing, they looked legitimate enough. Brant's bodyguards shifted nervously, hands moving toward their guns. But 4 against 2 were poor odds, especially when one of the 4 was Clara Jennings, who'd already killed more men than most of them had fingers. This is ridiculous, Brant said, but sweat was beading on his forehead now. You can't prove anything. It's the word of a dead, corrupt marshal against mine. Can't I? Clara reached into her jacket and pulled out one more document, genuine this time. Geological survey of my property commissioned by your mining company 6 months before the fire. Detailed assay showing copper deposits worth over $200,000. She threw it on the table beside the other papers. Motive, Maxwell. Clear as spring water and twice as pure. Brant stared at the survey, his face going pale. Where did you get that? Your own files. Funny thing about hired guns, their loyalty only goes as deep as their pay. When the shooting started and they realized they were working for a child killer, some of them developed sudden attacks of conscience. Another lie, but Brant couldn't know that. Clara could see him calculating, weighing his options. Run and he'd be hunted for the rest of his life. Fight and he'd likely die in the next few minutes. Confess and he might live long enough to find a way out. You're bluffing, he said finally. Maybe, but there's one way to find out. Clara's hand moved to her gun. Draw, you murdering bastard. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Every man in the saloon held his breath, waiting for the violence that would come. That's when the real surprise walked through the door. Nobody's drawing on anybody, said a voice from the entrance. This is still a civilized town, whatever you folks might think. Judge Morrison stood in the doorway, his black robes dusty from hard riding. Behind him came a squad of territorial cavalry, their Spencer carbines at the ready. "Your Honor," Clara said, not taking her eyes off Brant. "This is unexpected." No more unexpected than a federal marshal turning up dead on the road to Millerville, along with 3 other men. Morrison stepped into the saloon, his weathered face grim. Care to explain that Mrs. Jennings? Clara felt the trap closing around her, but kept her voice steady. "Self-defense, Your Honor. They were going to murder us to keep us from testifying, so you say. But I've got 4 bodies and only your word for what happened." Morrison looked around the saloon, taking in the tense standoff. "Seems to me this town's had enough killing. Time for some actual law and order." Law and order. Clara's voice was bitter as wormwood. "There's been no law in Dustwell since Maxwell Brant bought and paid for it. No order except what serves his greed." "That's a serious accusation, ma'am." "It's the truth, and I can prove it." Clara gestured to the papers on Brant's table. Evidence of conspiracy murder corruption, going back years. Morrison approached the table, studying the documents. Clara held her breath, praying her forgeries would pass inspection under the judge's experienced eye. "Interesting," Morrison said finally. "If authentic, these would certainly be grounds for investigation." He looked directly at Brant. "What do you say to these charges, Maxwell?" Brant's mask finally slipped, revealing the cornered animal beneath. "It's all lies, forgeries. This woman is insane with grief. She'll say anything. I'll say my son burned to death because you wanted copper more than you valued human life." Clara's control snapped, her voice rising to a scream that cut through the saloon like a blade. "I'll say you're a child-killing son of a bitch who deserves to hang." The saloon erupted. Brant's bodyguards went for their guns. Elias brought up his rifle. The cavalry troopers raised their carbines. For one terrible moment, it looked like everyone was going to die in a hail of lead. Then Maxwell Brant did something that surprised everyone, including himself. "Wait," he shouted, raising his hands. "Wait, damn you all." The guns wavered but didn't lower. Brant looked around the room, seeing death in every face, and made his choice. "All right," he said, his voice breaking like a dam in flood. "All right. Yes, I had her house burned, but I never meant for the boy to die. It was supposed to be empty. They were supposed to check first." The confession hit the room like a thunderclap. Men who'd suspected the truth for years finally heard it spoken aloud, and the weight of their complicity settled on them like lead blankets. "Keep talking," Judge Morrison said quietly. "The copper. There were millions in copper under that worthless land. I needed it to pay my debts. The drought had ruined me. I was mortgaged to the hilt." Brant's composure was cracking like ice in spring. "I made her fair offers, more than fair. But she wouldn't sell, wouldn't listen to reason. So you decided to burn her out." Not like that. I told Keats to set a small fire, just enough to scare her into leaving. But he was drunk careless. The whole house went up at once." Tears were streaming down Brant's face now. "I never wanted the boy to die. Never wanted any of it to go so far." Clara felt something break inside her chest, not more breaking, but the opposite. A loosening, a release. For 3 months, she'd carried the weight of uncertainty, the terrible possibility that she was wrong, that Tommy's death really had been an accident. Now she had the truth spoken from the killer's own lips. "Tommy was supposed to be at his friend's house that night," she said quietly. "Billy Morrison's birthday party. But Billy got sick at the last minute, and Tommy came home early." Brant nodded miserably. "We saw the boy's bedroom light, but Keats said the room was empty. Said he'd checked. But he was drunk and..." He covered his face with his hands. "God forgive me, I let it happen. When I realized the boy was inside, I could have stopped it, could have sent help, but I was afraid of what it would mean for me. You let my son burn to death to save yourself. Yes. The word came out as a whisper. Yes, God help me, I did. Judge Morrison looked around the silent saloon. Well, gentlemen, I'd say that constitutes a confession to conspiracy and negligent homicide at the very least. Negligent hell, Clara snarled. He heard Tommy screaming and did nothing. That's murder. That'll be for a jury to decide, Morrison said firmly. But first we need to get everyone back to Millerville alive. He gestured to the cavalry sergeant. Arrest Mr. Brant. We'll hold trial next week. As the soldiers moved forward with shackles, Clara felt a strange emptiness settle over her. For months, catching Tommy's killer had been her only purpose, her only reason for drawing breath. Now it was over, and she didn't know what came next. Mrs. Jennings, Judge Morrison said, as Brant was led away in chains, "You'll need to come with us as well. There are still questions about those bodies on the road." Clara nodded wearily. "I understand, Your Honor." As they prepared to leave the saloon, one of the townsmen, Pete Hoskins from the general store, approached her hesitantly. "Mrs. Jennings," he said, his voice thick with shame, "I want you to know, some of us suspected about Brant, about what he was capable of. But we were scared, and we told ourselves it wasn't our business." "It became your business when you let a child die for it," Clara replied coldly. Hoskins flinched as if struck. "I know, we all know, and we'll have to live with that for the rest of our lives." Clara looked around the saloon at the assembled men, cowards and collaborators, every one of them, but also neighbors, fellow human beings who'd lost their way in the maze of fear and greed that Maxwell Brant had built around them. "The question is," she said finally, "what are you going to do about it?" The trial of Maxwell Brant lasted 3 days and drew spectators from across the territory. Clara testified for 6 hours, telling her story from beginning to end, while Brant sat at the defendant's table, his face buried in his hands. The prosecution was handled by the territorial attorney general himself, a sharp-eyed man named Carlyle, who'd made his reputation prosecuting cattle barons and mining bosses. He methodically destroyed Brant's defense, presenting evidence of the conspiracy, the cover-up, and most damning of all, Brant's own confession. The defense attorney, imported from Denver at enormous expense, tried to paint Brant as a man driven to desperation by financial ruin, claiming the fire was never intended to harm anyone. But the jury, 12 men who'd seen the burned remains of Clara's house, who'd heard Tommy Jennings scream in their dreams, wasn't buying it. When Elias Ford took the stand and described watching the fire consume the house, while Brant's men prevented any rescue attempt, several jurors openly wept. The verdict came back in less than an hour: guilty of conspiracy to commit arson and felony murder. Judge Morrison sentenced Maxwell Brant to hang by the neck until dead. Clara felt no satisfaction as the sentence was pronounced, only a bone-deep weariness. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow somehow. Tommy was still dead. The 3 months of hell she'd endured couldn't be undone, and the scars on her soul would never fully heal. After the trial, she found herself standing on the steps of the Millerville courthouse, not sure where to go or what to do next. For so long, her entire existence had been focused on this moment. Now that it had arrived, she felt strangely empty. "Clara." Elias Ford approached his arm, still in a sling, but his face clearer than she'd seen it since they'd met. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I thought I'd feel different, better. But mostly I just feel tired." "Justice doesn't heal wounds," Elias said quietly. "It just stops them from festering. The healing has to come from somewhere else." "Where?" "I wish I knew. Maybe from deciding what comes next." Clara looked out at the bustling streets of Millerville, at the people going about their normal lives, unaware that a small piece of the world had been set right today. She thought about Dustwell, about the men who'd stood by and watched evil triumph, about the work still needed to repair what had been broken. "There's something I need to ask you," she said to Elias. "About what you said in the saloon about Collins keeping records." Elias's face went carefully neutral. "What about it? Collins wasn't keeping records, was he? There was no confession, no correspondence with the territorial marshal." "No," Elias admitted. "That was all bluff. Very convincing bluff, but bluff nonetheless. And those 3 federal marshals you brought with you, bounty hunters, expensive ones, used up most of the money from selling Collins' horse and gear." Clara almost smiled. "You helped me lie to a federal judge and threaten a man with illegal execution." "I did." "Why?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. "Because sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes justice needs a helping hand, even if that hand isn't entirely clean." Clara nodded understanding. They'd bent the rules, possibly broken them, but they'd achieved something the law alone couldn't have. They'd forced the truth into the light. A young woman approached them hesitantly, Clara Chen, and the same woman who'd come to Clara's ranch in Montana in the original timeline, but now arriving at a different moment in Clara's story. "Mrs. Jennings," she said quietly, "my name is Clara Chen. I heard about what you did here, how you brought Maxwell Brant to justice. And what can I do for you, Miss Chen? I have a situation that might require someone with your particular talents." Sarah's voice carried familiar determination. "There's a man in Nevada Territory who's been forcing Chinese families off their gold claims, stealing their mines, sometimes worse. The law won't help because he owns it just like Brant owned Dustwell." Clara studied the young woman, seeing her own pain and determination reflected there. "What makes you think I can help?" "Because you proved it could be done. You showed that even the most powerful men can be brought to justice if someone's willing to pay the price." Clara felt something stir inside her, not the cold rage that had driven her for months, but something warmer, more purposeful. The skills she'd learned, the connections she'd made, the reputation she'd earned, they could serve a larger purpose than just her personal vengeance. "Miss Chen," she said finally, "I think we should talk." 6 months later, Clara Jennings stood in the cemetery outside Millerville, looking down at 2 graves side by side. The larger headstone read, "Thomas Jennings, beloved son, taken too soon." The smaller one beside it said simply, "Toby Mitchell, he stood for what was right." Clara had moved Tommy's body here after the trial, wanting him to rest somewhere peaceful, somewhere the shadows of Dustwell couldn't reach. She'd also arranged for Toby to be buried beside him, and the boy who died trying to help her find justice deserved better than an unmarked grave on his family's hardscrabble ranch. She knelt and placed fresh wildflowers on both graves, as had become her weekly ritual. "I kept my promise, baby," she whispered to Tommy's headstone. "The man who killed you is gone. But I found something else, something I think you'd be proud of." In the 6 months since Brant's execution, Clara had become something she'd never expected: a champion for those who couldn't champion themselves. Word of her victory in Dustwell had spread across the territory, and desperate people began seeking her out. Widows facing corrupt sheriffs, farmers being driven off their land by cattle barons, miners cheated by claim jumpers. She'd helped Clara Chen expose the Nevada mining conspiracy, leading to the arrest of 3 territorial officials and the return of stolen claims to their rightful owners. She'd assisted a group of farmers in organizing against a railroad company that was seizing land through fraudulent legal proceedings. Most recently, she'd helped bring down a corrupt marshal in Arizona who'd been selling protection to outlaw gangs. The work was dangerous, often thankless, and never paid well. But it gave Clara something she'd lost in the flames that took Tommy purpose beyond mere survival. Elias had stayed with her through it all, serving as her partner and closest friend. The guilt that had haunted him since Atlanta was slowly fading, replaced by something like peace. Helping Clara fight for justice had given him a chance at redemption he'd never thought possible. "You ready?" Elias asked as Clara rose from beside the graves. He was holding the reins of 2 horses, their saddlebags packed for another journey to another town where justice needed a helping hand. Almost. Clara reached into her jacket and pulled out a letter that had arrived that morning. We got a response from that lawyer in Colorado, the one representing the Cherokee families whose children are being taken by the Indian agents. And he wants to meet. Says if we can prove the agents are selling the children to mining companies as labor, he thinks he can get the territorial governor to intervene. Elias nodded grimly. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning. But first, Clara looked back at Tommy's grave one more time. First, I want to spend one more night remembering what we're fighting for. As they walked back toward town, Clara felt a familiar presence at her shoulder. Not Tommy's ghost, she didn't believe in such things, but the memory of his love, his innocence, his belief that heroes always did what was right, even when it was hard. She'd never be the same woman she'd been before the fire. That woman had died with her son in the flames of their home. But what had risen from those ashes was something harder, more dangerous, and perhaps more necessary. A guardian angel with a gun, standing between the weak and those who would prey on them. The sun was setting over the mountains as they reached the edge of Millerville, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, another train whistle blew, carrying passengers toward uncertain destinies in an uncertain world. Clara Jennings pulled her hat down against the evening breeze and smiled grimly. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new injustices to fight, new dragons to slay. But tonight, she would rest easy knowing that in at least one small corner of the world, justice had prevailed. Tommy would have been proud, and that, Clara realized, was enough. Not complete happiness, she wasn't sure she'd ever know that again, but enough peace to keep going, enough purpose to make the pain worthwhile. As they rode toward their hotel, neither Clara nor Elias noticed the figure watching them from the shadows beside the telegraph office. A man in an expensive suit with pale, calculating eyes, someone who'd been asking questions about Clara Jennings, someone who represented interests that preferred their business conducted in darkness. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, justice slept peacefully in a small cemetery outside Millerville, guarded by the memory of a woman's love for her son, and her refusal to let that love die unavenged. The war for justice never truly ended. But sometimes, if you were willing to pay the price in blood and tears and sleepless nights, you could win a battle or two, and sometimes that was enough.